Push it. By sunset, there won't be a house left to argue about. That's what HOA President Vanessa Pike said while a yellow bulldozer crushed the front porch of my cliffside home. I was 3 counties away at a judicial conference when my security camera sent the first alert. By the time a sheriff's deputy reached the property, the house my father had built, and the last place my wife ever called home, was already lying at the bottom of a 200-foot ravine. Vanessa had an emergency demolition order and a polished explanation. She claimed my home was abandoned, structurally dangerous, and sitting on HOA land. Every word was false. My deed predated her HOA by 46 years. A county engineer had inspected the slope 6 weeks earlier and declared it stable. And the judge whose signature appeared on Vanessa's demolition order had retired years ago. I didn't call her. I didn't threaten her. I saved every camera file, opened the county records, hired my own attorney, and removed myself from everything that came next. 7 days later, Vanessa and her lawyer walked into the courthouse smiling. Her attorney looked up at the bench, saw my black robe, and dropped the folder in his hand. "Vanessa," he whispered, "that's Chief Judge Mercer." And he had not seen the sheriff's evidence yet. The first camera alert had arrived at 10:17 that morning. A flatbed truck stopped outside my gate, carrying a yellow bulldozer with fresh mud packed around its tracks. Vanessa's white SUV pulled in behind it, followed by 2 HOA security vehicles and a contractor wearing a reflective vest. The bulldozer operator climbed down, looked at the house, and then studied the cliff behind it. "You're sure the owner knows about this?" he asked. Vanessa held up a document bearing a red county seal. "The owner abandoned the property. We have emergency authorization. My caretaker, Walter, stepped onto the driveway and told them the house was occupied. The lights were on. Food was in the kitchen. My truck was parked beneath the carport." Vanessa didn't care. She ordered HOA security to move Walter behind the gate and pointed toward the porch. The bulldozer's blade struck the front steps first. The wooden railing folded beneath it. The porch posts snapped. Then the windows in my wife's old reading room shattered across the floor. Walter called the sheriff while the machine pushed deeper into the house. The operator hesitated again. Vanessa told him to keep moving. At 10:42, the western wall gave way. The house tilted toward the ravine, hung above the edge for 3 silent seconds, and then disappeared. When the deputy finally arrived, the operator was standing beside the empty foundation, staring down at the debris below. He asked Vanessa who had authorized the demolition. She tapped the signature at the bottom of the order. A judge did. That house had never been just another piece of real estate. My father built it in 1978, long before the first HOA sign appeared on the mountain road. He was a structural engineer who trusted stone, steel, and measurements more than promises. Every support beam had his handwriting on it. Every window faced the valley exactly the way he intended. Even the fireplace stones had been carried up the mountain 1 truckload at a time. Years later, the house became the place where my wife Ellen spent the final months of her life. Her favorite chair sat beside the western window, the same window the bulldozer shattered before pushing the house over the cliff. On clear mornings, she would sit there with a blanket over her knees and watch hawks circling above the river. After she died, I left that room almost untouched. Vanessa never cared about any of that. She cared about the view. The HOA controlled the neighboring ridge and had announced plans for a luxury clubhouse. The early drawings included a glass observation deck, a private restaurant, and an event terrace overlooking the valley. My house blocked the most valuable angle. Vanessa offered to buy my land twice. Both offers were less than half its appraised value. When I rejected the second one, she stood at my gate, smiled, and said, "Everyone eventually learns what progress costs." 3 months later, I found the first HOA violation notice attached to the same gate. It ordered me to repaint a house that had never belonged to her HOA. I mailed the notice back with a copy of my deed and a short letter explaining that my parcel had never joined the association. Vanessa responded with 3 more notices. The first accused me of using an unapproved exterior color. The second demanded the access code to my private gate for what she called community emergency access. The third imposed a $500 fine because my old pickup supposedly lowered neighborhood property values. I didn't pay any of them. At the next HOA meeting, Vanessa displayed a map with my property shaded the same blue as the community lots. She called me a holdout homeowner who was interfering with neighborhood safety and blocking responsible development. One resident raised his hand and pointed out that my parcel sat outside the recorded HOA boundary. Vanessa dismissed him with a wave. "County maps are outdated," she said. "The board has broader authority in emergency situations." A week later, she installed a sign beside my private road. Community emergency access. I didn't tear it down. I photographed it. I saved every notice, every envelope, and every email. I recorded the dates, the names of the board members involved, and the language Vanessa used to justify each demand. Then she filed a formal complaint with the county claiming my foundation was unstable and that the house could slide off the cliff during the next storm. Her report said dozens of residents lived directly below it. I unfolded the county topographic map across my kitchen table. Below my house were 200 feet of rock, a dry ravine, and 6 miles of protected forest. There wasn't a single home beneath that cliff. The county sent an engineer named Rachel Kim 2 days after Vanessa filed the complaint. Rachel spent nearly 4 hours inspecting the bedrock, foundation bolts, drainage channels, retaining wall, and support beams. She photographed every structural point and compared the slope with surveys going back 20 years. Vanessa arrived halfway through the inspection and tried to hand her a folder. "You should know the board considers this structure an immediate threat," she said. Rachel didn't take it. "The board doesn't certify foundations," she replied. "Engineers do." Her final report was 12 pages long. The house showed no active movement. The foundation was secure. The drainage system was working correctly. The only recommended repair was a loose section of porch railing. Rachel signed the report, stamped it, and emailed copies to me and the county building office. 6 weeks later, 2 days before the demolition, I received an automated notice confirming that an emergency application had been filed for my address. The applicant was listed as Daniel Mercer. I had never filed it. At the bottom of the form, beneath the words "Owner consents to immediate demolition," someone had signed my name. Before I could reach the building office, Vanessa submitted a second document, an emergency demolition order bearing a red county seal and the signature of Judge Harold Benton. The order claimed my house could collapse within 24 hours. It authorized immediate removal without the usual notice period or opportunity to appeal. No one called me. Instead, Vanessa scheduled the bulldozer for the following morning, knowing I would be away at the judicial conference. Walter later told me the contractor had hesitated from the moment he arrived. The house looked occupied because it was occupied. The lights were on. My clothes were inside. Food was in the refrigerator. Walter had a key and a written caretaker agreement. Vanessa told the crew none of that mattered. "The owner has already consented," she said, pointing to the signature someone had copied onto the application. When Walter called the sheriff, a man wearing a county safety vest stepped forward and identified himself as an inspector. He told the dispatcher that delaying the demolition could endanger lives. He wasn't a county employee. He was a private consultant who had worked for Vanessa's developer 3 times that year. My exterior cameras captured him covering one lens with his hand. He missed the camera above the garage. That camera recorded Vanessa watching the bulldozer break through Ellen's reading room. The operator asked whether they should stop until the sheriff arrived. Vanessa looked toward the cliff and shook her head. "Don't stop until the whole thing is over the edge," she said. "Once it's gone, no court can put it back." I reached the property just before sunset. The first thing I saw was the concrete foundation ending at open air. Everything beyond it was gone. The kitchen table my father had built, Ellen's chair, the cedar beams with his measurements still penciled into them, all of it lay scattered across the ravine below. Near the edge, I found the broken silver frame that had held our wedding photograph. The glass was missing, but part of Ellen's face was still visible beneath the dust. I stood there for a long time. Then I placed the frame in my truck and started documenting everything. I photographed the tire tracks, the damaged gate, the empty foundation, and every piece of debris I could safely reach. Walter gave the sheriff a complete statement. I downloaded the camera footage to 3 separate drives. One went to my attorney, one went to the sheriff, one went into a safe deposit box. My attorney sent preservation notices to the HOA, the contractor, the developer, and the county building office. Every email, text, invoice, camera file, and board recording connected to my property had to be preserved. I also contacted the state judicial administrator and formally recused myself from every civil, criminal, and administrative proceeding related to the demolition. I wasn't going to use my position to touch the case. I didn't need to. The sheriff compared Vanessa's demolition order with the county records and contacted Judge Harold Benton at his home. Benton had retired years earlier. He had never reviewed my property, never signed an emergency demolition order, and had never met Vanessa Pike. When the sheriff showed him the document, he studied the signature for a few seconds. Then he looked up. "That isn't mine." By the third day, the investigation had uncovered something larger than a forged signature. My attorney compared the HOA's meeting records with documents filed by a private development company called Summit Crest Properties. 6 months earlier, Summit Crest had completed plans for the luxury clubhouse on the neighboring ridge. The design included a glass observation deck, a restaurant, and a private event terrace facing the valley. The best view crossed directly through my property. More importantly, the clubhouse footprint extended 17 feet onto my parcel. Vanessa had known that before she made her first offer. The bulldozer contractor agreed to preserve his emails and invoices. Those records showed that the demolition had been paid for using the HOA's emergency reserve account. The payment had been routed through a construction company owned by Vanessa's brother-in-law. Then investigators found a draft consulting agreement. Summit Crest had promised Vanessa a percentage of the clubhouse membership revenue once the land was cleared and construction began. She wasn't protecting the community from a dangerous building. She was removing the one house blocking her private deal. The most damaging evidence came from a message Vanessa had sent to the developer 2 nights before the demolition. It read, "Once the old house is gone, Mercer will take the insurance money and leave. Then nothing will stand between us and the view." She had mistaken my silence for surrender. She didn't understand that every false notice, every forged document, and every dollar taken from the reserve fund had left a record. 7 days after my house disappeared, those records were waiting for her at the courthouse. Vanessa arrived wearing a navy suit and the same confident smile she had worn beside the bulldozer. Her attorney, Grant Holloway, carried 2 leather folders. Grant had been told this was a routine emergency hearing involving a disgruntled retired homeowner and an HOA that had acted under a valid safety order. Vanessa was still whispering about settlement numbers when they entered Courtroom 1. They were 15 minutes early. I was finishing the morning docket, a contract dispute that had nothing to do with my property. From the bench, I watched Grant take 3 steps through the doorway before he finally looked up. He stopped so suddenly that Vanessa walked into his back. One of his folders slipped from his hand and hit the floor. "Grant, what are you doing?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His eyes moved from my black robe to the nameplate in front of me. Chief Judge Daniel Mercer. Then he leaned toward Vanessa without taking his eyes off the bench. "Don't say another word." "Why?" The color had drained from his face. "Because that's Chief Judge Mercer. That's the man whose house you destroyed." I gave no sign that I had heard him. I completed the ruling in front of me, thanked the attorneys, and left through the judge's entrance. Seconds later, another door opened. Visiting Judge Eleanor Shaw entered carrying the sheriff's evidence file. She took the bench and waited until the courtroom doors were closed. "Before we begin," she said, "Chief Judge Mercer has formally recused himself from every civil, criminal, and administrative matter connected to this property." Vanessa glanced at Grant as though that announcement had rescued her. It hadn't. "Judge Mercer will have no role in deciding this case," Judge Shaw continued. "The evidence, however, will." Grant rose and requested additional time to review the documents Vanessa had given him. Judge Shaw refused any delay that might allow evidence to disappear. She ordered the HOA to preserve every email, text message, invoice, board recording, and financial statement connected to my property. The association's reserve accounts were temporarily frozen. Vanessa and the other board members were forbidden from deleting, transferring, or altering data on their phones. Then the sheriff handed Grant a copy of the supposed demolition order. He studied Judge Benton's signature and looked at Vanessa. "You told me this came directly from the county." "It did," she whispered. The sheriff placed a flash drive on the evidence table. Judge Shaw turned toward the courtroom monitor. "Let's begin with what happened at 10:36 that morning." The lights dimmed. Vanessa's own voice filled the room. The first video showed her standing beside the bulldozer with the emergency order in her hand. On the screen, the operator asked whether they should wait for the sheriff. Vanessa's answer echoed through the courtroom. "Don't stop until the whole thing is over the edge." No one spoke when the house disappeared from view. The next exhibit was Rachel Kim's engineering report. Judge Shaw read the conclusion aloud. "No active slope movement. No structural emergency. No legal basis for immediate demolition." Then the sheriff played a recorded interview with retired Judge Harold Benton. "I did not sign that order," Benton said. "I have not issued any judicial order since my retirement." Grant slowly closed the folder Vanessa had given him. The forged owner consent form appeared next. My signature had been copied from an old public court document. Under magnification, even the spacing and ink pattern matched. Then came the clubhouse plans. The date in the corner showed they had been completed nearly 2 months before Vanessa claimed my house had become an emergency. The final exhibit was her message to Summit Crest. "Once the old house is gone, Mercer will take the insurance money and leave." Vanessa stood abruptly. "The contractor misunderstood my instructions." The sheriff paused the video and moved it back 12 seconds. Her face filled the screen. "Keep pushing," she said. "I want the entire structure gone." Grant turned toward Judge Shaw. "Your Honor, I was given documents I now believe were materially false. I need to withdraw from representing Ms. Pike personally." When the courtroom lights came back on, the sheriff was no longer standing near the door. He was standing directly behind Vanessa. He did not handcuff her inside the courtroom. Instead, he informed her that she was being detained for questioning and instructed her to surrender her phone. For the first time since I had met her, Vanessa had nothing prepared to say. The board members sitting behind her moved away, as though a few feet of distance could separate them from the video they had just watched. Judge Shaw referred the forged order, the false owner consent form, and the reserve fund payments to the county prosecutor. She suspended Vanessa's authority to act for the HOA and appointed an independent administrator to protect the association's records. By that afternoon, Summit Crest had withdrawn from the clubhouse project. The HOA's insurer announced that intentional destruction and fraud were excluded from coverage. The contractor agreed to cooperate with investigators. Vanessa was later charged with forgery, conspiracy, destruction of property, and misuse of association funds. 2 board members accepted plea agreements after admitting they had approved payments without reviewing the documents placed in front of them. The residents suffered the most immediate consequences. They discovered that their reserve fund, the money meant for roads, roofs, drainage, and emergency repairs, had financed the destruction of my home and Vanessa's private development scheme. As deputies escorted her from the courtroom, she passed the evidence monitor. It was still frozen on the final frame of my house disappearing over the cliff. Vanessa looked at the screen once. Then she lowered her head and kept walking. The criminal case lasted 11 months. Vanessa eventually pleaded guilty to forgery, conspiracy, and misuse of HOA funds. The court ordered restitution, and the association reached a separate settlement for the destruction of my home. I could have rebuilt the same house on the same foundation. I chose not to. Instead, I built a smaller home farther from the cliff. Several stones recovered from my father's fireplace were placed into the new one. Ellen's restored wedding photograph now sits beside another western window overlooking the valley. The clubhouse was never built. Residents elected a new HOA board and adopted rules requiring independent legal review before any emergency action could be taken against private property. Financial records were open to every homeowner. Official county maps were attached to the association's governing documents, so no future president could invent a boundary with a marker and a presentation board. I used part of the restitution to create a local property record clinic for seniors and veterans. Volunteer surveyors and attorneys now help people check deeds, liens, easements, and false HOA claims before small problems become disasters. Vanessa had destroyed my house because she believed removing the building would erase my rights. But ownership was never stored inside the walls. It was written in the deed, preserved in the records, and defended by evidence she could not push over a cliff. Vanessa believed authority came from a title, a clipboard, and enough people willing to follow orders. She thought that if she destroyed the house quickly enough, the truth would disappear with it. But real authority leaves a record. It has a signature that can be verified, a boundary that can be surveyed, a camera file that can be copied, and a deed that remains valid after the walls are gone. I never used my courtroom to punish Vanessa. I stepped aside because justice is not revenge, and power means nothing if it cannot be trusted. All I did was preserve the evidence and make sure it reached a courtroom she could not control. My father's house was gone. Ellen's reading room was gone. Nothing in any settlement could replace those things. But the land was still mine. My name was still on the deed. And the view Vanessa tried to steal never became part of her clubhouse. Sometimes the loudest person in the room looks powerful only because everyone else is still gathering proof. Vanessa had a bulldozer. I had the record. And in the end, only one of those survived the fall. What would you have done after seeing that first security alert?